Infidelity, right? It's something we know can really tear relationships apart.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's actually, sadly, it's more common than you might think.
Yeah.
The stats on it are kind of startling. When you look at U.S. adults who are married, something like 21% of men and about 13% of women admit to having cheated on their spouse at some point.
Wow.
So it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
And when we think about the reasons why infidelity happens, we usually jump to the obvious stuff, right? Like there's just problems in the relationship,
Right.
or someone's not feeling committed anymore.
Yeah, for sure.
But today we're going to explore something a little bit different, perhaps a bit of a surprising angle,
Okay.
and that is the role of sexist beliefs.
Interesting.
Specifically, how sexist beliefs in men might be linked to infidelity.
Got it.
And we're not just talking about the blatant kind of sexism, the obvious negativity towards women.
Right.
We're also going to delve into how even seemingly positive beliefs about women can actually play a part in this. It might sound a little counterintuitive at first,
Yeah.
but stick with us. It'll become clear as we go.
Okay.
To unpack this whole thing, we need to start with a concept called ambivalent sexism.
Okay.
This is an idea that was put forward by researchers Glick and Fisk.
Okay.
And it really helps us understand that sexism is not just simple prejudice. It's more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
It actually has two sides to it, a hostile side and a benevolent side.
Interesting.
So to set the stage for our deep dive today, let's break down these two sides of sexism a little bit for everyone listening. What exactly do we mean by hostile sexism and benevolent sexism?
Sure. So hostile sexism is kind of the one everyone thinks about.
Yeah.
It's the more obvious one.
Right.
These are the straight up negative attitudes and behaviors towards women.
Yeah.
And they're usually aimed at trying to maintain male dominance and control.
Yeah.
And punishing women who step outside those traditional roles.
Okay, so give us some concrete examples so people can really hear what this sounds like.
Yeah, sure. So you might hear statements like, women are just trying to gain power over men by manipulating them. Or once a woman gets a guy to commit, she's going to try to control him and put him on a tight leash.
Okay.
Those are actually example items from a scale that researchers use to measure hostile sexism.
So those definitely sound like some pretty big red flags if you hear those in a relationship. Right?
Yeah, for sure.
But you mentioned this other side, this benevolent sexism.
Right.
And how can sexism be benevolent? It almost feels like we're talking about an oxymoron here.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
And it might be even more insidious because it's less obvious.
Right.
Benevolent sexism presents itself as positive.
Okay.
So these are seemingly nice or positive attitudes towards women,
Yeah.
but they're still based on this idea that women are delicate and need protection from men, that they need men to provide for them.
Okay.
So it's kind of this patronizing chivalry.
Got it.
And examples of this that you might hear are things like, a good woman deserves to be cherished and put on a pedestal by her man, or men should always be willing to sacrifice their own well-being to support women financially.
Okay, so I can definitely hear the difference in tone, right? The hostile sexism is very clearly negative and demeaning.
Right.
But this benevolent sexism, it almost sounds, on the surface at least, gentlemanly.
Yeah.
Like, is that really a bad thing?
Yeah, that's the tricky part. It can sound nice, but it's still harmful.
Okay, explain that.
So the key for everyone to understand is that both types of sexism, even though they feel different, they both reinforce traditional gender roles and inequality.
Okay.
Benevolent sexism, it does this by basically rewarding women who conform to these limited roles.
Okay.
Right? It's like saying, we'll treat you well, we'll cherish you, as long as you stay in your place, as long as you stay in this more subordinate position.
Yeah, it's like a gilded cage, sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so for our deep dive today, what we really want to figure out is whether these underlying sexist beliefs that men hold, both the nasty ones, the hostile ones, and the seemingly nice, benevolent ones, whether they actually translate into a greater likelihood of these men being unfaithful.
Right.
And maybe even more importantly, whether women are even aware of this connection, particularly when it comes to the benevolent sexism.
Yeah.
Because, on the surface, a guy who's saying all those nice things about women wanting to protect them and provide for them, you might think, oh, that's a good guy, he's not going to cheat. But is that really the case?
Right.
So the research we're going to be looking at today really gets at that. It dives deep into whether these different flavors of sexism are actually predictive of infidelity in men.
Yeah.
And whether women can intuitively spot this potential link.
Very cool.
So let's jump into the research.
Okay.
The first study we're going to look at was designed to see if there's even a connection, a straightforward link between sexist attitudes in men and how likely they are to be unfaithful. What did they find?
So in this first study, they had 379 heterosexual men who had been in romantic relationships.
Okay.
They recruited them online, and they got all their demographic info, like their age and ethnicity and whether they were currently in a relationship or not.
Okay.
And then they measured their levels of hostile and benevolent sexism using that ambivalent sexism inventory that we were talking about before.
Okay, and how did they measure infidelity? Did they just straight up ask, hey, have you ever cheated? Because you'd think people might not be totally honest about that.
Yeah, that's a good point. They actually used a couple of different approaches to try to get a more accurate picture.
Okay.
So first, they used a scale that measured infidelity intentions.
Okay.
So they weren't asking about past behavior. They were asking about things like, how likely would you be to cheat if you knew you wouldn't get caught? Or would you hide a new relationship with an attractive person from your current partner?
Okay.
So they were tapping into these intentions and thoughts about infidelity rather than just past behavior. And then they did also ask directly about past infidelity.
Okay.
How many times had they cheated in the past?
Okay.
But they also asked about their own experiences with being cheated on.
Okay.
And they included what's called a social desirability scale.
Okay.
And what this does is it measures how much people are trying to present themselves in a positive light.
Okay.
So basically trying to see, are people sort of faking good here? Are they downplaying any negative behaviors?
Yeah, that makes sense. You want to control for that
Yeah.
because people want to look good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with all of that, what did they find? Was there a link between sexism and infidelity?
Yeah, they found some really interesting results. So they found that both hostile and benevolent sexism were significantly correlated with both infidelity intentions.
Okay.
So those thoughts about cheating and actual past infidelity behavior.
Okay.
But here's where it gets even more interesting. Even when they statistically controlled for things like whether the man had been cheated on himself, how much they were trying to appear socially desirable, and their age, both hostile and benevolent sexism still independently predicted infidelity intention.
Wow. Okay, unpack that a little bit.
Okay, so basically what that means is that even if a guy had never been cheated on before,
Okay.
and he was trying to present himself in a really positive light, and no matter how old he was, if he had stronger hostile or benevolent sexist beliefs, he was still more likely to say that he would cheat on a partner.
Okay, so that's pretty significant
Yeah,
because it suggests that there's something unique about these sexist beliefs that's linked to this intention to cheat, even when you account for all these other factors that we often think about.
exactly. Yeah,
Okay, so intention is one thing.
right.
Doesn't always lead to action.
True.
What about actual infidelity behavior?
Yeah, so they looked at that too.
Okay.
And they found that the link was still there, although the strength of the prediction was a little bit weaker. So after controlling for those same factors, hostile and benevolent sexism were still uniquely associated with whether or not a man had actually cheated on a partner in the past.
Okay, so it's not just that they're thinking about it or saying they would do it.
Right.
There's actually a link to their past behavior as well.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's a pretty strong initial finding, right?
Right.
It suggests there is something going on here,
Yeah.
but they didn't just stop there. They
Yeah.
wanted to dig deeper. They
Yeah.
wanted to understand, why is this link there?
Yeah.
Why are sexist beliefs connected to infidelity?
Exactly.
And that's where the second study comes in,
Right.
right?
Right.
So tell us about that one.
So study 2 aimed to replicate the findings from that first study,
Okay.
but also go further and explore why this link exists.
Okay.
And they focused on the idea that men who hold these sexist beliefs might place a higher value on having power in their romantic relationships. And that desire for power might be the missing link explaining this connection to infidelity.
Okay, but help us understand that.
Yeah.
How does sexism relate to a desire for power in a relationship?
Right.
And then how would that lead to infidelity? It seems like there's a few steps there.
Yeah, so let's break it down.
Okay.
If you think about the core of sexist beliefs, whether it's hostile sexism saying that women are trying to control men, or benevolent sexism saying that women need men to take care of them, both of those are ultimately reinforcing this power imbalance where men are in the dominant position.
Yeah.
So the researchers were thinking that maybe men who endorse these beliefs might just inherently value having more control and influence over their romantic partners.
Okay, so they're already starting from this place of wanting that power dynamic.
Exactly.
Okay, and then how does that desire for power translate into infidelity?
Right. So there's some research suggesting that when people feel powerful, it can actually activate their sexual goals
Okay.
and make them less inhibited in their behavior. And so you can imagine that someone who feels like they're in a position of power, they might feel less bound by the rules of a relationship.
Yeah.
And they might see infidelity as a way of asserting their dominance or proving their sexual prowess, even if it's a really warped way of thinking about it.
Right, so it's like this sense of entitlement almost.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay, so study 2, they had a similar setup to the first study,
Yeah.
but they added some new measures.
Right.
Tell us about that.
So in this study, they had a larger sample,
Okay.
544 heterosexual men with romantic relationship experience.
Okay.
And again, they were recruited online,
Okay.
and they repeated those same measures of ambivalent sexism and infidelity intentions.
Okay.
But they expanded how they measured actual infidelity behavior.
Okay.
So in addition to asking about past infidelity, they also asked about extradyadic sex.
Okay.
So sex outside of the relationship, both in the past year and in the past 5 years.
Yeah.
And then crucially, they added a new scale that measured how much importance these men placed
Yeah.
on having power in their relationships in general.
Okay.
So it was getting at that underlying desire for power.
Got it.
And they also included some other measures like self-perceived attractiveness, education level, income, social rank, all these other things that could potentially be influencing the results.
Okay, so they're really trying to get a comprehensive picture here.
Exactly.
Rule out other explanations.
Right.
So what did they find in study 2?
So they replicated those initial findings.
Okay.
They found that both hostile and benevolent sexism were again linked to both infidelity intentions and actual infidelity behavior.
Okay.
And even after controlling for all of those additional factors.
Okay.
And importantly, they found that both forms of sexism were also positively correlated with how much importance those men placed on power in their relationships.
Okay, so that supports that initial idea that those two things might be connected.
Exactly.
But just because they're correlated doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other. Right.
Right. How did they figure out if this desire for power was actually explaining the link between sexism and infidelity?
Yeah, so to do that, they used a statistical technique called a mediation analysis.
Okay.
And basically what this does is it tests whether the relationship between two things, in this case, sexism and infidelity, can be explained by a third thing, which in this case is importance of power.
Okay, got it. So it's like that middle step that connects those two.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the results of the mediation analysis showed that the importance placed on power did significantly mediate the relationship between both hostile sexism and infidelity,
Okay.
and also benevolent sexism and infidelity for both their intentions and their actual behavior.
Wow. Okay. So that really suggests that this desire for power in a relationship is a key factor that helps explain why sexist beliefs might be linked to infidelity.
Exactly.
And it's not just about the hostile sexism.
Right.
It's about both types.
Yeah, which is really interesting.
Yeah, it suggests it's something deeper, right?
Than just this overt negativity towards women.
Right.
It's about wanting that control.
Yeah.
Okay, now the third study we're going to look at takes a different angle.
Okay.
This time they're focusing on women's perceptions.
Okay.
So rather than looking at men's attitudes and behavior, they want to see, do women pick up on this increased risk of infidelity that's associated with sexist men?
Yeah.
So how did they study that?
So in study 3, they had 240 heterosexual American women.
Okay.
And these women were recruited online.
Okay.
And then they were randomly assigned to read one of 3 different profiles of a guy named Mark.
Okay.
So one profile described Mark as holding hostile sexist beliefs.
Okay.
Another profile described him as holding benevolent sexist beliefs.
Okay.
And the third one described him as not really endorsing any sexist beliefs, so more of a non-sexist profile.
Okay.
And the researchers made sure that these profiles very clearly reflected those different types of sexism based on that questionnaire we've been talking about.
Okay, so it was clear for the women reading it.
Exactly.
This is what this guy believes.
Exactly.
Okay, so the women read about Mark's beliefs, and then what did they do?
So after they read the profile, they were asked to rate Mark on a couple of things.
Okay.
So how likely they thought he was to be unfaithful in a relationship,
Okay.
and how patronizing and undermining they thought he would be as a partner.
Okay.
And then the researchers also assessed the women's mood like how they were feeling after reading the profile.
Okay, why did they do that?
So they wanted to control for any potential emotional reactions.
Okay.
Because reading about sexism, particularly hostile sexism, can be upsetting.
Yeah.
And they didn't want that to influence the other ratings.
Okay, that makes sense. So what were the findings in this third study? Were women good at spotting the infidelity risk, and did it differ depending on the type of sexism?
So the results were pretty interesting. So when it came to the hostile sexism profile, the women did rate Mark as being significantly more likely to be unfaithful compared to both the benevolent sexism profile and the non-sexist profile.
Okay, so they picked up on that.
Yeah. And it wasn't just because they were in a bad mood after reading the hostile sexism profile.
Okay,
They controlled for that statistically.
got it.
And there was no significant difference in how likely they thought the benevolent sexist and the non-sexist guys were to cheat.
Okay, so they could spot the red flags when it came to hostile sexism.
Right.
But what about the guy who was described as having benevolent sexist beliefs?
Yeah, so they did recognize that he might be patronizing.
Okay.
They rated the hostile sexist guy as the most patronizing and undermining.
Okay.
Then the benevolent sexism guy was rated second, and the non-sexist guy as least patronizing.
Okay.
So they could tell that there was something kind of condescending about those benevolent sexism beliefs.
Yeah, so they recognized that element of it,
Yeah.
but they didn't connect that with infidelity.
Exactly.
And that's the really surprising part.
Yeah, even though they could see that the benevolent sexism guy might act in ways that are kind of patronizing and controlling, they didn't see him as being any more likely to cheat than a guy who doesn't endorse those sexist beliefs.
Yeah. Okay, so that suggests there might be a bit of a blind spot here.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
For women, when it comes to assessing the risk of infidelity in men who hold these seemingly positive beliefs about women.
Yeah.
Okay, why? Why might that be? Why wouldn't women pick up on that connection?
So the researchers have a few ideas about this.
Okay.
They suggest that benevolent sexism can often be mistaken for genuinely positive qualities,
Yeah.
like chivalry, protectiveness,
Yeah.
a desire for commitment.
Yeah.
These things that on the surface seem really appealing in a partner.
Right.
And there's even some research showing that some women find benevolently sexist men more attractive
Wow.
and perceive them as more willing to invest in a relationship.
Okay.
So these things that might make a guy seem like a good catch on the surface
Yeah.
might actually be masking these underlying power dynamics that are at play.
Okay, so the very things that make him seem like a good partner could actually be the things that are linked to infidelity.
Right, which is really interesting
Yeah.
and potentially worrying.
Yeah, that's a bit unsettling. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are the overall takeaways from these three studies?
So the main takeaway is that both hostile and benevolent sexism in men are linked to an increased likelihood of infidelity,
Okay.
and that this connection seems to be driven by a stronger desire for power in relationships.
Okay.
But the really key finding, and the more surprising finding, is that while women seem to recognize the infidelity risk in guys who are overtly hostile,
Yeah.
they don't seem to see that same increased risk in men who hold these benevolent sexist beliefs.
Yeah.
Even though they can tell that those benevolent sexist guys are more likely to be patronizing and controlling.
Yeah.
So it suggests that we need to be aware of these more subtle forms of sexism
Right.
and how they might be playing out in our relationships.
Yeah, it's not just about avoiding the obviously bad guys.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that even these seemingly harmless and, as you said, even attractive qualities like chivalry and protectiveness
Yeah.
can actually be warning signs for you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so this research really gives us a lot to think about.
It does.
Right. But no research is perfect.
Of course.
Did the researchers highlight any limitations of these studies?
Yes, they did point out a few things.
Okay.
So firstly, the first two studies, these were what we call cross-sectional studies,
Okay.
meaning they looked at one point in time.
Yeah.
And so we can't definitively say that sexism causes infidelity.
Yeah.
It could be the other way around.
Yeah. Right.
Or there could be some other factor influencing both.
Yeah, they just happen to go together.
Exactly.
Okay.
And also, they relied on self-report for the infidelity measures.
Yeah.
And obviously, people aren't always completely honest about that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
We have to take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah. Yeah, they could be downplaying it.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then in that third study, the descriptions of the men, the profiles that they used were pretty blatant.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily how sexism presents itself in everyday life.
Right. It's more subtle usually.
Exactly.
Okay.
So,
Uh.
it's not a perfect reflection of reality.
Yeah, and they were all online samples.
Right.
So maybe not representative of everyone.
Exactly.
Okay, so what do they suggest for future research in this area?
Yeah, so they said future studies could try to follow people over time
Oh, okay.
to get a better understanding of that cause and effect.
Yeah, does sexism lead to infidelity, or is it the other way around?
Exactly.
Okay.
And they also said it would be interesting to look at whether similar patterns hold for women's sexism and their infidelity,
Yeah.
because, gender roles and power dynamics might play out differently there.
Right. Totally different expectations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then they also mentioned looking at sexual versus emotional infidelity separately, because those might have different predictors.
Yeah.
And then finally, using more naturalistic ways of manipulating sexism.
Yeah.
So not these blatant profiles, but more subtle ways of presenting sexist attitudes.
Yeah. More like how it happens in the real world.
Exactly.
Okay, so at the end of all of this, what's the big aha moment here? What do we really want people to take away?
So the big aha moment is that while we might instinctively recognize that blatant hostility towards women is a warning sign in relationships, those seemingly positive, chivalrous beliefs that benevolent sexism can also be a subtle but significant predictor of infidelity,
Okay.
and that this link might be stemming from this desire for power that women may not immediately pick up on.
Yeah, it's hidden beneath the surface.
Exactly.
Okay, so this research really makes you think,
Yeah.
right, about the complexities of sexism
Yeah,
and how it can impact our relationships.
for sure.
And it's not always as straightforward as we might think.
Exactly.
So for everyone listening, think about that. How might recognizing these more subtle forms of sexism change how you understand your own relationships or the relationships you see around you?
Right.
Should we all be a little bit more critical of those seemingly harmless gender stereotypes?
Yeah, it's something to think about.
Definitely something to ponder. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
My pleasure. It's been a really thought-provoking conversation.
Yeah, and hopefully it's given our listeners some new insights into this less obvious side of infidelity.
I hope so. Thanks again.
Thank you.